Hello and welcome to By the Book. I'm your host, Joe Hebert. Today we continue our course on truth, justice, and leadership with a study of Plato's Gorgias. In previous episodes, we saw that Socrates had approached Gorgias, a teacher of rhetoric, and asked him, what is the power of rhetoric? And Gorgias answered that it's a power of persuasion without knowledge. Now, this raises a problem because in art, techne in Greek is supposed to be practical knowledge. But it also raises a problem because persuading people without knowledge seems to be deception, which is unjust. Gorgias is not able to give a coherent answer to that. His student Paulus steps in and says the answer is that we know we're committing injustice, and that's good because that's how you get ahead in life. So Socrates then tackles this question: is injustice really good the way that you're assuming it is? And the first point that Socrates makes about that is that if power is the ability to get what we want, what do we really want? We want happiness. And how can we be happy? Being happy means being in a good condition, having what's truly good for us. But that means we have to know what's good for us. And if we don't know what's good for us, then getting what we want may be bad for us. So he says true power requires knowledge. So the idea that you have power when you're doing things without knowledge is self-contradictory. It doesn't work. And the next part is that Socrates raises the ugliness of injustice, and Paulus has to admit that injustice, even if it's useful in some ways, is ugly. And Socrates says, well, isn't ugliness a bad thing? Isn't beauty a good thing? And Paulus agrees with that wholeheartedly. So Socrates points out to him that if you live a life of injustice, even if you hide it from everybody else, you're going to have to live with that. You're going to have to live with the ugliness of your own soul. And how could you be happy that way? If you consider yourself repulsive, how is that a recipe for happiness? And Paulus doesn't have an answer for that. Now, Callicles steps in and he says, well, my answer is simple. I'm going to defend injustice. I'm going to say it's beautiful. I'll be happy being an unjust man. I'll admire myself for being unjust. And so he's going to push Socrates really hard. But, and this is a much longer section that we're still working through. But it starts with Callicles using the concept of nature and saying by nature, some people are superior and they deserve to rule. And injustice is just the tool they use to do that. So it's part of their superiority. And he's defining superiority in terms of strength until Socrates points out to him that actually, by your own admission, the strong and the superior are often held down by the weak people who outnumber them. And so, there's a contradiction in his claims, and he has to resolve this by saying, well, what I really mean by superior is the smart people. Okay, and he's never going to get anywhere with this because, once you see that the weak are outpower the strong and they're outsmarting the strong, there's no way you're going to be able to define the superior people as superior if they're being outwitted as part of your narrative, right? So but they switch now to the question of intelligence. And here Socrates' key point is that in everything where we can confirm that somebody has intelligence, that they have understanding, it is always confirmed by their precision. So they act with precision. If you understand a thing, you know the right button to push, you know the right way, to do it. If you don't, if you're just like pushing all the random buttons on the machine, it shows you don't know, you don't understand, you're just guessing. So the person who says, well, in my life, I just want to have power and I want to have as much pleasure and as much money and as much whatever as possible, shows you haven't really thought about the meaning and the purpose of life. And in the next phase, the one we looked at last time, Socrates gets into the question of pleasure and the good. Callicles claims that the purpose of life is to maximize pleasure. Now, there's two things about this Socrates shows. First of all, he gives all kinds of examples of people who are basically addicts, like people who are just, mindlessly doing things for the sake of pleasure. And it's obviously not helping them to live a good life. It's actually preventing them from living a good life. And he said, do you admire people like this? And Callicles tries to pretend like he does, but it's obviously not real. He's not trying to live that way. That's not his goal. So he's starting to really expose that Callicles doesn't even really believe what he's saying, even though he's stubbornly insisting that he's going to defend these arguments. And finally, Socrates gets Callicles to admit, although very reluctantly, through examples like eating and drinking and things like this, that pleasure, as nice as it is not the good. Pleasure is a sign of what might be good if we read it correctly, but there's always an objective good that is what we really should care about. And so the reason that we drink, for example, is not because it's pleasant to drink, although it can be in the right circumstances, but because our body needs a certain amount of water in it. But if we already have the right amount of water, we don't want to keep drinking and drinking and drinking. That's going to hurt us. So the thing we're really aiming at is the objective good. And so again, getting back to what is power, what is strength, what is intelligence, what is knowledge, those who are really smart and those who really know how to thrive and live well are not trying to get as much pleasure as possible. They're trying to think what is beneficial to my body, what's beneficial to my soul, and that's what they're trying to accomplish and do. And so Socrates demonstrates the importance of discipline, basically, of avoiding the pleasures that are harmful and even accepting the unpleasant things that would be healthy for the sake of actually having a good, healthy body and a good, healthy soul. And that's where we left off last time. And we noted that Callicles wanted to throw in the towel, not admitting that he's defeated, but just sort of sulking and leaving the conversation. But Gorgias interrupts, and this is very significant that Gorgias, although he's never going to complete the discussion with Socrates personally, he intervenes to tell Callicles, you better let Socrates finish this argument. But at this point, Gorgias is actually very interested in hearing Socrates' conclusion, which is what we will turn to now. So the first thing we have here is Socrates kind of recapping the nature of what is good. We've seen many hints of this earlier in the dialogue, but he's going to spell it out now much more clearly. The virtue of each thing, that is the perfection or the excellence of a thing, of a piece of equipment or a body or also of a soul. So it doesn't matter if it's inanimate or animate or even the soul itself. Any living thing doesn't come to be present most beautifully just at random, but by an arrangement and a rightness, and by whichever art is given over to each of them. Is that so? I say it is. He's answering himself because Callicles is not enthusiastic about this conversation anymore. Okay, so goodness is defined in terms of order. And I think it's important to see here that we're talking about both the internal order of a thing. So if all the parts are internally working correctly, then that's a necessary component to excellence. But also there's a larger order of things, a cosmic order, as we're going to see, and things have to fit together with each other in the right way. So if you think about your body, for example, all the parts of your body have to be in the right, internally, for example, your heart has to be pumping properly and stuff. But then, the blood vessels, the lungs, the muscles, the skeleton, everything, each of them individually has to be in the right order, but they also have to be interacting properly. And if they clash with each other in some way, then that can be deadly. Also, the external environment. As long as we have oxygen to breathe, our lungs are doing great. But if we were in an environment with no oxygen, then our lungs wouldn't be able to help us and we would suffocate. So, therefore, the virtue of each thing is something arranged in an arrangement and made orderly. It's a maintenance of that order is the key, and becoming as orderly as possible. Therefore, a certain orderliness that's native to each thing when it comes to be present in it is what makes each of the things there are good. So if order is the essence of the good, then we get to see basically the cardinal virtues here: moderation, wisdom, justice, and courage. So wisdom, for example, you would have to know the order of things. You would have to know what is the order of things as a whole, what is the order of each thing within it, so you can see what would make it healthy or good. And a moderate person, he says, would do what's appropriate in regard to both gods and human beings, since he wouldn't be moderate if he did inappropriate things. So here we're looking at moderation, but it's also being connected to the virtue of justice. So moderation, as he said before, if you understand how something works, then you have precision in how you treat it. You don't treat a pencil like a toothbrush, for example. You know the difference between them. But once you apply this to other persons, to other rational beings, he says here, gods and human beings, then this gets us into what we would call the virtue of justice, giving to each what is owed. If you treat a human being as a thing, as an object, as a stepping stone to your own desires, for example, then it's sort of like treating a pencil like a toothbrush. You don't recognize what the thing is. You're not treating it according to its nature. So this is where we see the internal order connecting to the external order, because the internal order of the soul, reason is the ruling part of the soul, and reason is the part of us that can understand the order of things. So if we are treating something as something that it is not, then we are acting like an irrational being. And when we're doing this towards other rational beings, that's a particularly grave fault, which we would call injustice. Okay? And this applies to the gods as well. So it applies to the virtue of piety or religion, treating the gods in accordance with their superior mode of existence. It's a necessity that these things be so. And if he does what's appropriate in regard to human beings, surely he'd be doing just things and pious things in regards to the gods. So moderation becomes justice and piety in this analysis, because we're treating everything like what it is, and this includes other people and justice and the gods and piety. And someone who does this is just and pious, and in fact, it's a necessity that he be manly as well, or courageous, because it's characteristic of a moderate man not to pursue or avoid things that are inappropriate, but to pursue or avoid what one should, actions and people as well as pleasures and pains, and to be steadfast in enduring whatever one should. So this goes back to the argument for discipline that he made earlier. If we really understand what's good and we have the moderation, to desire that, and we have the justice, to do that, then we also will have the courage to endure whatever is necessary for that, because we see it's worth it. It's worth the sacrifice. It's worth the suffering that may entail to achieve that good. So then we get a discussion of how this applies to leadership, okay? Because the rhetorician, even though he is, he's aiming at his own benefit, but at the same time, he's taking sort of a leadership role. He's persuading people of what to do, and that's how he gets ahead. And we see that the people that Polus and Callicles are emulating, a lot of them are the great politicians, the great statesmen, tyrants, emperors, but also democratically elected leaders, whoever they think just did a really good job of getting a lot of power and influence. So this raises the question of the relationship between the leader and society, and what would be the virtuous way of being a leader in society. And Socrates says, this seems to me to be the target one ought to live with his eye on, bending all his own efforts and those of his city towards this. So the same logic that applies to the individual, knowing what is good, knowing what is the right order of things, acting with moderation and justice and courage, this would apply to the city or the polis as well, acting in such a way that justice and moderation will be present for a person who's going to be blessedly happy, and not toward letting his desires be undisciplined and trying to give them their fill, a trouble that has no end while he lives the life of a plunderer. So you notice that Socrates specifically points out that for the individual, this life of infinite desires is unfulfilling, it's futile, it leads to unhappiness as well as injustice. But he then draws out the political implications of that. For that sort of person would not be dearly loved by any other human being or God, since he's incapable of sharing anything. And where no single thing is shared, there can be no friendship. So, this kind of selfishness, there are two problems. First of all, it doesn't satisfy the selfish person. He fails to achieve happiness. But second, it puts him at odds with everyone else, and it leads to enmity, not friendship, with the rest of the world. Now, notice how this would apply to Machiavelli's Prince. Machiavelli, in a sense, is agreeing with this when he throws friendship out the window at the beginning of the Prince. So he says, yeah, you're going to have to give up on friendship. But then he brings in a different kind of friendship, an alliance between the prince and the people. And it's one where they both remain completely selfish, but supposedly, according to him, there can be an ongoing, mutually advantageous kind of relationship. So we won't analyze that again here, but we'll just point out that Socrates would say at least two things. First of all, the premise of that is false, because nobody can be satisfied with this kind of life, regardless of how we relate to others. It's not intrinsically rewarding to live this way. But the idea that this all-out selfishness is just somehow going to work into an ongoing peace, between the prince and the people, it seems like you're sneaking some kind of order of things back in after you rejected that moral order at the beginning. How can you be so confident that this is all going to work out in the long run without having to believe in some kind of order of things that you have already rejected to make this argument in the first place? So Socrates is quite explicit that, and we're going to look here at the theological side of his argument, because Socrates, of course, is in the ancient pagan world. This is prior to Christianity. And he has no reference to Judaism, so we don't see the Judeo-Christian God per se in this argument. But Socrates engages in what we could call natural theology. That is, he thinks about, well, if we reason about the nature of things, what would be reasonable for us to believe about God or the gods? And here he says, those who are wise declare, Callicles, that heaven and earth and gods and humans are held together by the shared bond of friendship, and by orderliness, moderation, and justice. And for this reason, my comrade, they call this whole a cosmos, not a disorder or dissipation. In Greek, the word cosmos just means order. So the universal cosmos is the order of all things, what Tocqueville calls the admirable order of all things. And Socrates says there's a reason we call it cosmos, because it has a magnificent order to it. And that means that God or the gods, whoever is behind this cosmos, because we're not, like we didn't make that, right? But that being who governs the cosmos must be rational the way that we are, because it's through our reason that we can perceive order and we can act in accordance with order. So that orderliness of things indicates sort of a divine mind. This is what is sometimes called the God of the philosophers, or nature's God, as the Declaration of Independence puts it. Simply the idea that we can see that there is an intelligent moral design to the nature of things. And so when we follow this design, we are practicing friendship, not only with other wise and intelligent human beings, but also with the divine. So bringing this back to the specific question about rhetoric, here we see that Socrates clearly is rejecting the model of rhetoric that is used by Gorgias and his students, which is simply persuading without knowledge for one's own selfish purposes, which, as we now see, turn out to be futile and destructive to the common good of society. But he holds out in this paragraph and elsewhere that there could be a valid form of rhetoric. Someone who's going to be a rhetorician in the right way will need to be just and knowledgeable about what's just. After all, which Paulus in turn said Gorgias had agreed to on account of shame. So in other words, Gorgias didn't really think that, but that must be true. Going back to his first exchange with Gorgias, he says this is what we really ought to be studying, really ought to be searching for in terms of rhetoric. And as we go through the rest of this dialogue, Socrates is not going to develop this concept, but this is important to keep in mind because if you were to, really meditate on the lessons of this dialogue, which we're only touching on in this series, this I think would be one of the big things you would want to work on further, is really unpacking how a good rhetoric could work. Because as we're going to see, the attempt to do the right thing and to bring justice to society is difficult and dangerous. And it could be greatly assisted by a rhetoric that was grounded in virtue and justice. But Socrates, again, he's going to leave it at basically telling them, you guys are doing the wrong kind of rhetoric, and I recommend that you turn your lives around, and then maybe after you do that, you might be able to come up with a better kind of rhetoric. Now, we're skipping over some details. One thing that happens in this discussion is that Callicles is really insistent that this wisdom that Socrates is talking about is quite foolish. And we know it's foolish because somebody who tried to live that way is going to get himself killed. And as we'll see, Socrates is going to admit that this is quite possible, even likely, that if you pursue justice and truth, it can get you killed. So, the ultimate answer is not that this is wrong, but is to put that in context. What is really most important? What are we really aiming at in life? And so here he talks about what happens if our goal is to succeed in life in the sense of being accepted, either to actually be the ruler or to be close to the ruler and friendly to the ruler, on good terms with the ruler. What does that imply? It implies that we're going to have a corrupt soul, right? Because if the ruler is somebody following similar logic to what Gorgias, Pallas, and Callicles are actually doing, then the ruler is corrupting his soul or their souls if it's a case of, as he applied this to Athenian democracy, the majority of the people. So where the ruler is a savage, uneducated tyrant, if there were anyone in the city who was much better than he, the tyrant would presumably be afraid of him and would never be capable of becoming his friend with all his heart. And Callicles admits that. So virtue, justice, is a threat to tyrants. And so just pursuing, even privately, trying to live a just life in a tyrannical regime is a dangerous thing. And so Socrates is really calling attention to the choice that we have to make in life. And this applies to both public and private life. Are we willing to take the risks that are inherent to living a good life, part of which is going to be offending people who have power and influence, who are not pursuing justice and will take our pursuit of justice as a threat? But what if we decide, well, no, I don't want to risk my neck that way. I just want to have a quiet, simple life. Here's what Socrates says about that. Therefore, if any of the young people in that city were to reflect, what's the way I could get great power and have no one do me any injustice? It looks like this would be the path for him, to get accustomed straight from youth to being delighted and annoyed by the same things himself as his boss, and prepare himself to be as much like that person as possible. So the greatest evil will befall him when he's depraved in soul and maimed by imitation of his boss and by his power. So this is a very significant passage. Socrates is talking about the pitfall of going along to get along, the pitfall of conformity to society. It seems like it's the safe path, the path that's going to lead to peace and contentment and well-being, but it's a path of a corruption of soul, because we're going to have to pretend to like the same things and dislike the same things as those who have power, and on the premise that those with power are unjust It means we're going to have to conform our souls to their injustice. So this really shows what's at stake in political society with leadership. If we have bad leadership, which this dialogue indicates that the vast majority of leaders in most societies are corrupt, then it's something that makes it very difficult and dangerous for citizens to pursue justice, even in a private kind of capacity. And it's partly how Socrates explains his own life, that he's not trying to rule the city, but he's still taking great risks simply by talking about what justice is and pursuing justice as a private person. So we have to decide what's more important, justice or self-preservation, safety. And there's again a longer discussion here that we're passing over, but this is extremely important, especially for modern society, because as we've already seen, part of Machiavelli's strategy for modern society is you keep the people happy by giving them their pleasure and their security and their well-being, their material well-being. And this has become the dominant formula within modern society. I'd say by far, the biggest legitimation that modern, governments have is, it's the economy, stupid. It's keeping, people safe and secure and content with the possessions that they have. And so one of the things Socrates does here is, because Callicles and Polus and these others here are in the upper classes, they look down on the mechanics and the shipbuilders and the ship pilots and the people who basically are keeping other people alive. They kind of look down on them. But Socrates says your best defense you have of your way of life is that it's going to keep you safe. And yet you look down on these other people who are keeping you safe. And yet that's all your life is about, apparently. It's just you're going to corrupt your own soul if necessary in order to be safe. That's what Callicles has come to at this point in the argument is, well, I can't refute your argument any other way, but all I can say is it's not going to be safe to live that way, Socrates. And he says, you're right, it's not going to be safe, but here's where he just comes out and says, safety is not the goal of life. But you blessed happy fellow, see whether what's high-born and good isn't something other than saving and being saved, meaning saving life. Because that, just living for some length of time, is something to be disdained by anyone who's truly a man. Being in love with life on any terms is not for him. So this is cowardly, Socrates says, cowardly to think that I'm going to live as long as I can, no matter what it takes, no matter what compromises I have to make. Dragging my life out as long as possible is more important than living a good life. So the just man, the wise man, Socrates says, turns over concern for those things to the God instead. So we're going to see here that, again, theology becomes very important at the end of this dialogue. We have to entrust the length of our earthly life to God, or the God, the divine. All right, again, this is not necessarily a Christian argument, but as we'll see, it's very compatible with Christian theology when we look at Thomas Aquinas. And he says the thing that needs to be considered is in what manner he can live this time he's going to live in the best possible way. So our job is to live as well as possible for as long as we are here, not to try to drag our life out as long as possible while degrading the quality of our lives. So coming back to the example of himself, Socrates says, there'd be nothing strange about it if I were to be put to death. Do you want me to tell you why I foresee that? So he's actually predicting his own execution, which is going to happen a little down the road. And Callicles says, quite so, like he seems to be a little surprised maybe that Socrates is not only admitting this, but prophesying that, yeah, I probably will be, put to death. And Socrates says, I believe I'm one of a few Athenians, not to say the only one, to make an attempt at the political art. This is going back to what he said before. Instead of rhetoric, he would recommend true politics, which is the art of seeking the health of the soul. And now he says, I'm probably the only one in the city who's doing politics. which is ironic because he seems to be the only one in the city who's not doing politics the way everybody else does. But he's saying that's because I'm the only one doing true politics, the only one in the present day to be actively engaged in political matters. Seeing as how I'm not speaking with a view to gratification when I make the speeches I make on each occasion, but with a view to what's best and not most pleasing. So defining politics in his sense of pursuing the good of the soul, he says, I may be the only one in the city who refuses to do anything else but actually pursue the good of souls. But of course, the implication is that if nobody else is doing that and he is implicitly criticizing them, just like with the tyrant, the majority of people in Athens are offended that he thinks that they're on the wrong track, that he doesn't think that they're wise, that he thinks they're unwise. And so there's an implicit rebuke of their life in the way that he's living. And so Callicles just can't get over this. How could you think it's good to put yourself in this kind of risk? Socrates has already accused him of cowardice for asking this, but he doesn't back down on it. He says, does it seem good to you, Socrates? Does it seem like a beautiful condition for a person in a city to be in when he's in that plight and powerless to stand up for himself? So he really can't fathom that Socrates is happy being vulnerable, that he could be arrested at any time and put to death because he's offending the powers that be in Athens, and he's okay with that. He's willing to accept that. And Socrates says, yes, Callicles, if that one thing belongs to him that you've repeatedly agreed about, if he stood up for himself by having said or done nothing unjust toward human beings or gods, because this has been agreed by us over and over to be the most powerful way of standing up for oneself. So he comes back and he insists true power is having what's truly good, which is a healthy soul. So as long as I'm just to human beings and gods, then my soul is healthy, and that is what is truly good. And it's not about living as long as possible. So he says repeatedly, if somebody comes and puts me to death, that person will be committing injustice. That person will be damaging his own soul, but my soul will be uncorrupted. Of course, the problem, which is probably driving Callicles' amazement here, is, well, what about your body, right? They're going to destroy your body, and you're going to be dead. So what good is a just soul going to be to you at this point? And here's where we get some more theology. Again, as Socrates says, you might consider this to be a myth. It might just be a story, mythos in Greek, that I'm making up. And in a sense, it is. In different dialogues, Socrates gives different versions of, say, an afterlife, and none of them are exactly the same. But Socrates says, he insists, I believe this is true. So there's some kind of truth in this. And if we look at the essence of the story, I think we can see the key features that are definitive of a Socratic, you could say, natural theology, what Socrates reasons about the nature of the gods and the nature, in this case, of the afterlife, what happens to the human soul after we die. He says, death, it seems to me, is precisely nothing other than a separation from each other of a pair of things, the soul and the body. So this is the classical definition of death, the separation of the soul from the body. So our body can be destroyed, but our soul cannot be destroyed. It's simply being separated from the body. Therefore, when they're separated from each other, each of them keeps its condition not much lessened from what belonged to it when the human being was alive. In other words, whatever you look like when you're alive, at least when you're recently dead, your body is going to look pretty similar. But with regard to the soul, he's going to argue your soul will retain its features after death, and this includes justice or injustice. Next, he goes to divine judgment. So when we die, we are judged by God or the gods. He looks at some myths about which gods are doing this. But the key point that he says is that our soul will be judged without any reference to our bodies or to any other external things. So whereas human judges when they look at us, they're always going to see, oh, our fancy clothes or our ragged clothes. They're going to see how we relate to other people around us. But the divine judge is simply going to look into our soul and simply going to see the justice or the injustice in our soul. And that's it. There'll be no hiding, no way to hide the reality of our souls. So when they come before the judge and he sees the soul filled with disproportion and ugliness as a result of license and luxury and insolence and lack of self-control in its actions, and seeing that, he sends the soul off in disgrace directly on the way to the place of detention, where upon its arrival, it's to endure the appropriate sufferings. And then he goes and breaks this down. He says there's basically two kinds of punishment in the afterlife. One is those whose vices were moderate will be punished until they're corrected. And then now that their soul is just, they will be able to enjoy the rest of their eternity. So it's sort of like purgatory. But others whose soul is so corrupt, so wholly corrupt, that it's unsalvageable, will simply be punished for eternity as an example for the correction of others. So bringing this back around to the question of leadership, Socrates says, well, who do you suppose are those who will be most severely punished for eternity? He says, really, Callicles, it's from among the powerful ones that the exceptionally depraved human beings come. So power corrupts. This is one of the messages in Plato's Gorgias. Though nothing prevents good men from also turning up among them, and any who come along are exceptionally worthy of being admired. So yes, there are some rulers, some powerful people who are just and good, and they're especially to be admired because power tends to corrupt, and they were able to overcome that temptation. But numerically speaking, most of the people who had most of the power ended up becoming corrupt and will be severely punished in the afterlife. Because it's a difficult thing, Callicles, and worthy of abundant praise when someone who comes into a position with great license for committing injustice lives out his life justly. But there are a few people of that sort, since they've turned up both here and elsewhere, and I imagine they'll continue to do so, people who are beautiful and good at that virtue of administering justly whatever anyone turns over to them. So again, it's important to see that Socrates is not rejecting rhetoric and he's not rejecting power and politics, although he is putting them in a very specific light and saying that they are more often than not, they are corrupting, because we want to persuade without knowledge and get away with that. We want to have power to get what we want without really thinking about what's beneficial for us. And those temptations are very, very powerful, but they can be overcome. There can be a rhetoric that is truth-based and justice-based. And there can be those who have power and use their power to do justice. And that makes it even greater and more glorious when they do so. And that is part of the message that Plato is trying to get through, especially in the long term, over the centuries. Can we cultivate societies and cultures in which we can have leaders who are actually aiming at truth and justice? And this is the note on which Socrates concludes. So, Callicles, I'm persuaded by these speeches, and I look out for the way I might display my soul to the judge in the healthiest possible condition. So, bottom line is Socrates is saying that we need to live our lives not aiming at worldly success, because that is certainly going to corrupt us. If we're trying to please the crowd, please those who are in power, and try to get as much power as we can, that will lead us astray. We have to lead our lives for the sake of the afterlife, for the sake of how we will be judged after we die. So we have to be willing to sacrifice power and status, popularity, even our lives, if necessary, for an eternal reward. But as we've seen, that doesn't close off the possibility that in some cases, people who are striving for justice may also be able to do some justice on earth and may have the opportunity to do so. We shouldn't expect that to be easy. We shouldn't expect that to be the normal thing, but it's something that is also worth striving for. So, saying goodbye to the honors that come from most human beings, I'll try by a training in the truth to be in my very being the best I have the power to be, both to live that way and when I die, to die that way. And I exhort all other human beings, as far as is in my power, and in return for your exhortation, I exhort you, because Callicles had been exhorting him to be safe, basically, like to stop being vulnerable like this. And he exhorts him back, and he says, I exhort you in particular toward this life and this form of combat. So this is what Socrates is arguing is true courage, true wisdom, true justice, and moderation. And it's not something that's going to lead to a soft, comfortable, easy life. It's something that can put anybody at risk, even if they're trying to live a humble private life, but potentially making others look bad and not going with the crowd. But particularly if we want to see how can this be applied to the betterment of society, how can this be, as Socrates does here, exhorting Callicles, if this Socratic message is to be shared further and further with those in society who have the potential to seek justice and truth. It's going to be a life of adventure, you could say, of a certain risk, a certain danger, but also certain rewards and glories that can be had from pursuing the truth in this way.